Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. So we are going to wrap up our series on sacrifice zones and our sub-series on Cancer Alley by talking about the organizations in Cancer Alley that are fighting for change and improvements in their communities. So on the last episode, we talked about the EPA and what they were doing and how they were responding to these complaints that were sent to them by the residents of Cancer Alley and how things are changing as a result. And it's important to recognize that these changes and these improvements don't happen on their own. They don't happen by themselves. There are groups, there are organizations, there are organized efforts in Cancer Alley that are pushing for these changes, people that are fighting for things to get better in their community. And so I want to just share with you just a couple of these organizations, and I want to just talk about how they are fighting and doing the hard work in one of the harshest, most polluted sacrifice zones in the world. That is what we'll be discussing today. Stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am Dr. Joseph. Thank you so much for listening. So in this episode, we are talking about the community groups throughout Cancer Alley who are fighting for change and who are responsible for all of the movement that we've been reading about and hearing about in this area over the last few months, maybe over the last year or so. These things don't happen on their own. They're not an accident. There are people fighting and fighting diligently for these changes. And there are so many different groups that we could talk about on this episode. I want to just highlight just a couple of them. And if you follow us on Instagram, we'll put up more and more images of all the varied groups in this area that are fighting for change. It's not just these two that we're talking about today, but there are many, many more that are fighting and pushing for things to be different in Cancer Alley. So let's just get right to it. The first and probably the most recognized group in Cancer Alley is Rise St. James. So Rise St. James is a faith-based grassroots environmental group that was founded by Sharon Levine in 2018. Now, if you look her up, if you do some research on her, you'll see that she is the daughter of civil rights activists, and she has lived in St. James Parish her entire life. So she grew up and watched how that community changed as a result of these polluters and these facilities coming in to her neighborhood. Before she started this group, she was a special education teacher and did that full time until she started seeing how much pollution and how much death and devastation was coming. And so she quit her job and dedicated herself full time to fighting for environmental justice across her parish. That's how she got started. And so it started with a small group in her living room fighting against an incoming, massively large plastics manufacturing facility. And in 2019, so they founded the group in 2018. In 2019, they successfully stopped the construction of this $1.3 billion, that's with a B, billion-dollar plastics manufacturing plant that was going to be built right on the river. She mobilized her community group. She educated the community. She went to the council meetings. She organized protests. Rise St. James, as they began to come together and grow as an organization, they did protests, they did marches, and they would continually put in front of people how damaging it would be for this facility to come to their neighborhood and pollute. That's already with all the other chemical plants that are in the area. And so all that advocacy, all that hard work led to the parish and the state shutting down the construction of this facility. A big victory, because this plant would have generated over 1 million pounds of liquid waste annually, and they would have pumped tons of carcinogens into the air every single day. And so this was a big victory for Rise St. James, and obviously that momentum carried itself as they continued to advocate and continued to push for better regulation, less emissions, and fewer facilities in their area. And so that is what Rise St. James did and continues to do behind the leadership of Sharon Levine. But of course, they're not the only ones that do this kind of work. So the second group I want to highlight on this episode is the Concerned Citizens of St. John the Baptist Parish. And so this group was founded in 2016 by a man named Robert Taylor. Now, what's interesting is Mr. Taylor was in his 80s when he started the group. So when I was reading about his story, his background, he grew up in St. John the Baptist Parish. He grew up on the plantation farmland where they did sugarcane harvesting and refining and all of those different things. If you remember, in previous episodes, we talked about how Cancer Alley used to be plantation country because there were tons of plantations, tons of sugarcane fields, and that's where slaves would work on those plantations to harvest and produce sugar. But then after emancipation, they stayed and continued that work on the land that they owned and continued to build a life for themselves until these plants came. And so Mr. Taylor was around for all of that. He was there back when it was an agrarian society and all they did was harvest sugarcane and live off the land, with cows and pigs and all the animals that they used to sustain themselves. In his interviews, he talks about how that changed from that kind of society to an industrial area where you have petrochemical plants, you have plastics plants, you have all kinds of facilities that are just pumping massive amounts of toxins into the air and into the water and into the soil. And he even talks about how there were these promises and these ideas that when these facilities come, it would be good for the residents, that they would get jobs, good paying jobs, it would benefit their communities, they could see more development, and they would, in the end, appreciate that they came and built and operated there. But that didn't happen either. And so he was quoted as saying, "We weren't prepared for industry. We are not really employed by the industry, and it brought no benefits to us. They're mostly poor, uneducated Black people in our communities, and the average income in my parish is $17,000. And so he can easily see that none of this development, none of this industrialization that's happening in their parish helped anybody that actually lived there whatsoever. And so he started this organization to push back against facilities that were there that were polluting and harming the community members. And their biggest concern was the Dinka plant. And so if you remember back, a few episodes back, we talked about how the EPA is suing them. We talked about how damaging their pollution is and how harmful their operations are to the people that live in Cancer Alley and particularly in St. John the Baptist Parish. Well, the Concerned Citizens are that group that was pushing the EPA for those lawsuits and pushing for better regulations on this particular facility. They've produced tons of literature, lots of educational material, and they've had protest walks and marches and continued advocacy to give everyone in that area and around the country an understanding of what was happening to them in their communities. And so all of that work was led by this small group, led by this gentleman named Robert Taylor, who at that time was in his 80s, who saw the issues, who understood how things used to be and how things changed and how they are now. And so he worked, galvanized people, and started fighting against the continued environmental injustice that he was experiencing and that his community was experiencing throughout the years. And now they're starting to see changes. The EPA is suing Dinka. There are newer regulations. I just saw an article yesterday where the EPA is proposing a new air pollution law that would force these types of industries to reduce their emissions. And so all of that advocacy, all of that work is due to groups like the Concerned Citizens of St. John fighting on the ground each and every day for things to be different. And so those are the two groups I wanted to highlight on this episode. There are so many more that are doing great work and so many different groups that support the community groups that are doing such great work. There's just not enough time to get into all of them. But follow us on Instagram. We're going to be posting all throughout the month of April the work and the groups and the researchers and the lawyers and all the people who were fighting in Cancer Alley. But I wanted to just highlight these two community groups because I want everyone to remember that this is how change happens. Change happens on the community level with the residents advocating for what they believe is the appropriate and proper way to manage what's going on around them. It's the community that has the influence and the power and the ability to lead and to show how we want to be governed and how we want our communities to be developed. And so when I was looking at these groups, there's a few things that I learned that I didn't think about before in this way, but I think it's worth sharing because I think it could be helpful for all of us listening. And so the first thing I learned was that these community groups are not calling it Cancer Alley. I should have known better. They're calling it Death Alley. And so there's been an evolution of the way that this area has been described. So first it was plantation country, then it was chemical corridor because of all the chemicals that came. Then it was Cancer Alley because they noticed and recognized the increased cancer rates that resulted from all these chemicals that they were breathing in, that they were exposed to. And now it's being called Death Alley because it's not just that people are getting cancer and living kind of difficult lives. They're dying at higher rates, and they're having to bury their community members earlier than they would like to because they're getting sicker and sicker sooner and sooner because of these activities. And so they're calling it Death Alley. And so I got to call it Death Alley too. So it's no longer Cancer Alley. It is Death Alley that we're talking about. The framing and the way the community understands the issue is the best way to talk about it and the best way to understand what needs to be done to address whatever's going on. Because obviously back when it was chemical corridor, okay, these chemicals are here. We don't really care so much for them. But what's the justification for reducing the amount of chemicals that are being produced around here, that are being manufactured and distributed? Well, now we know it was cancer. And it was cancer that was the issue because there were increased cancer rates. But now we can see that the death rates and the death toll that these plants are taking on these communities is just too much. It's Death Alley now. It's not Cancer Alley. We're calling it Death Alley. And so that's the first thing I learned. The second thing is that fighting these polluters is apparently a full-time job. You can't just do it on the weekends. You can't just do it when you get off work. Could you imagine that? You have a full-time job, 40 hours a week, but because there's so much pollution in your area, so much destruction and damage from these industries, you quit your job and you start an organization and you spend all of your time, all of your energy, all of your resources fighting against these polluters. I just can't imagine that. I mean, when you start a community group, the idea is supposed to be you just look out for each other. If something new is happening, you kind of make people aware of it. You go to the meetings, the council meetings to talk about your community and what your needs are. You know, schools, libraries, parks, grocery stores, roads, those kind of things. Maybe there's a water issue every now and then you bring it up so people know about it. But the idea that you would be full-time, consistently fighting to get these plants to just reduce the amount of pollution they emit into the air, it says a lot about how big the problem is. This is a huge problem that people are working full-time to address, right? The founder of Rise St. James quit her job as a teacher. I'm sure she loved her job. I'm sure she would rather be doing that job than having to spend all of her time trying to keep these huge plants out of her neighborhood, right? The founder of the Concerned Citizens of St. John, he's in his 80s. He's 80 years old when he starts his organization. He should be retired. He should be relaxing on his land, enjoying the weather, playing with grandchildren, and maybe volunteering a little bit here and there, maybe just showing up to just share some nice stories about life in the neighborhood, not starting an organization and working full time just to get the Dinka plant to stop polluting as much. But that's what it takes when it comes to dealing with these environmental justice issues, because just like they're working full time to push back, these industries have structures and systems and lawyers and public relations people and lobbyists that are working full time on their behalf to get their interests put forward in front of the council, in front of the mayors, in front of the people who vote on these issues. And it becomes a struggle just to be able to live comfortably in a home, in a community that you grew up in. And so you have to work full time to push against it. I learned that today. That's a tough lesson. The third thing I learned was that this community work is saving lives. It's saving lives. It's not restructuring the way the community is organized or what's happening there. It is literally saving people's lives, right? Imagine if these groups weren't there. Imagine if these plants, these facilities just kept getting built in these areas. Just more and more pollution, more and more contamination next to the schools, next to your neighborhood, next to your house. The council is just rezoning your residential area, making it industrial so they can bring in more facilities to dump more and more on to your children and to your family and to your friends. Imagine how much more death, how much more sickness would be present in these areas if these groups were not fighting against that, if they weren't fighting to shut down some of these plants, if they weren't fighting for reductions in emissions. This is life-saving work. This is not just community development. People's lives, the public health of these areas are directly impacted by these communities and what they are doing to highlight the issues and to get their elected officials to keep these facilities away and the existing ones to reduce what they're polluting around them. That is what these organizations are doing. That is what these groups are accomplishing with their work. It's amazing work, and it is something that you have to appreciate and encourage and continue to support, because this is truly monumental work that they're doing to keep their areas from being completely sacrificed, completely obliterated under the weight of these facilities. And so I learned that all of these things they're very inspirational for me. And so what do we do now? So what do we do moving forward? Right? We've talked about these issues. We've discussed the health implications. We've discussed what the EPA is doing, how these groups have sued, and how they have operated in order to deal with these polluters all around them. And so what can we do? We're listening to this right now. What can we do? So the obvious answer is give money, right? Everybody needs money. Money helps support causes. It helps provide resources so that things can be done. Donating is always welcome. Money is always welcome. So you can go to their websites. I have their links in the description. You can go to their websites and you can donate. They'll show you how. They'll show you how to support them financially. You should definitely consider doing that. You can also join the groups, right? So there's membership forms, there are membership forums, there's Facebook pages, ways that you can connect and be informed and be made aware of their initiatives and some of the things that they're trying to do to bring awareness and to fight for change, right? You can participate in their events. You can post what they're doing on your social media pages. All of those things, you can definitely do that. They would really appreciate it. I'm sure I would appreciate it if I was there. More people, more supporters, more voices, more exposure helps to apply pressure to the people who make decisions. And so that's always helpful, right? So you can do that. You can educate yourself, right? You can always learn about these issues, particularly issues relating to these types of marginalized communities. So environmental justice, when we talk about it, it's not simply that there's pollution in the air, in the water. There's pollution all over the country. The issue is that pollution and the effects of that pollution are disproportionately shared by the most marginal, the most vulnerable members of our society. And so we can learn about that and understand why that is and what the implications of that are for us and for those communities, right? So there's a direct link between the air pollution and the cancer rates. So why is the cancer rates so much higher, for instance, in Death Alley than anywhere else? Who are those people that live there? Why are they the ones experiencing such high rates of cancer and other illnesses, right? The asthma rates, bronchitis, COPD, all of these health issues that result from exposure to such high levels of air pollution, why is that the case? And why is it being placed on these poorer, low-income African-American communities across Louisiana? Why is that? I mean, we can learn and understand what those issues are. We try to talk about it on the podcast as much as we can because it's important to recognize these things. But we can always educate ourselves. We can always do that. An educated person is a powerful person. An educated person changes the way things are done. Once you learn and know, you can grow and you can make an impact. That's what education does. And these issues in particular are important because they affect all of us and not just some of us. All of us are impacted by the realities of this pollution and of these injustice issues that are permeating throughout our societies all across the world. We can learn about these things. And if you did all those things, you would be well on your way to making a major impact on the movement to address pollution and address the issues that are rampant across across Death Alley. You would be making a big difference, right? If you gave money and your time, if you joined these groups and supported them, if you educate yourself on the issues, you would be a game-changing type of person. But I want us to think a little bit bigger than that. Just a little bit bigger, because think about this. These two groups I just shared with you, one was started by a special education teacher, and the other was started by a man who was in his 80s, who grew up on a plantation in the 1940s, 1950s, right? And that's not to denigrate their professions because they are noble professions. Teaching, farming, supporting your community, lifting up the people around you, that is very important. But my point is that these people just looked around and they saw what was happening to their communities and they chose to do something about it. They didn't have any special training. They didn't have any special proclivities towards organizing or marching or demonstrating. They just looked around and they said, we cannot allow this to continue happening. We need to do something. And they started these organizations as a response to what was happening, what they saw in their communities. And you know what? We can do that too. Each and every one of us can do that. All of us can. I mean, where do you live? What's going on in your community, in your state, in your city, in your town? I mean, you don't need a master's degree in nonprofit management or a master's in public administration to organize and demand for things to be different. You can do it now just like they did. So we can look at their stories and we can see that real change can happen by just regular, ordinary people getting together and demanding it. And I think one of the best ways we can honor and appreciate these types of groups in Death Alley is by organizing our own groups and fighting for changes wherever we live and learning from what they did in terms of how they organized and how they fought for change, where they spoke, how they navigated the issues, and applying them to where we live and to our communities and to where we see issues of environmental justice and working to make those changes. Everybody should have clean water. Everybody should have clean air. Your environment should be free from all of these toxic contaminants and chemicals. We shouldn't have to live with all this around us, no matter who we are, no matter where we are. I mean, think about it. So the Rise St. James founder, Sharon, she started with 10 people in her room, in her living room. They got together and they said, can you believe what's happening? We got to do something. And they marched, they protested, they went to council meetings, they did all this kind of work, and look what happened. They were able to get this billion-dollar plant stopped from being built. I mean, imagine that. Imagine somebody who's in their 80s marching down the street, trying to get this one plant in his neighborhood to reduce their emissions. Year after year after year, he's building up a group. He's got this organization that's growing and growing. And we're now here in 2023. That plant is getting sued by the EPA. They accomplished real, tangible, definitive change in their communities just by getting up, organizing, and fighting for it. And so think about what we could all do if we organized in the same ways in our communities. What kind of change could we usher in? How many lives can we change? Right? I mean, I get inspiration, I get encouragement from looking at these stories, reading about these groups, and just thinking, man, they live in a poor, predominantly Black community with large corporations and industries coming and dumping on them. And they've organized and created an environment where they can push back against them. That's just tremendous, in my opinion. And so I've been thinking about this stuff, and I'm reading about these organizations. And when I see that, I say, you know what? I bet I can make the same kind of impact where I live. You can make the same kind of impact where you live. The people that you know who have been complaining and talking about these issues, you all can get together and you can really do something about it. There really is a way to make change, working from the ground up, being connected to people around you in your neighborhood, understanding the issues and how decisions are made in your community. We can all do this, and we can all collectively fight for change and fight for justice wherever we are located. And so it's happening here in Death Alley. It can happen anywhere and with any of us. All of us can do it. I know we can. And just looking at these two gives me that hope and gives me that encouragement and lets me know that anything really is possible if we get together and fight for change together. And that's our episode. Thank you for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.